In 1947, a young Bedouin shepherd boy was searching for a lost goat near the ancient settlement of Qumran, close to the Dead Sea. What he discovered in a cave would shake the foundations of biblical scholarship and reveal prophecies that had been hidden for over 2,000 years. As he threw a stone into the darkness, the sound of shattering pottery echoed back. Inside those clay jars were scrolls that would change everything we thought we knew about biblical prophecy. But here's what will shock you. Whether we're truly living in the end times, or whether there's more to these ancient texts than meets the eye, then comment why below. And make sure to subscribe, because what we're about to uncover will challenge everything you thought you knew about prophecy. History. It's 1947. And the world is still reeling from the devastation of World War II, is trailing his flock through the rocky terrain near the Dead Sea when one of his goats wanders off. As he searches among the limestone cliffs, he notices a small opening in the rock face. Curious, he throws a stone into the darkness. The prophecies of Ezekiel, Isaiah, and Jeremiah about the Jewish people returning to their homeland were being fulfilled in real time. They made discovery after discovery. Cave after cave revealed more manuscripts, more prophecies, more secrets that had been hidden since the time of Christ. In total, they found 981 separate manuscripts scattered across 11 caves. These weren't just copies of books we already knew about. Many of these texts had never been seen before, containing prophecies and visions that filled in gaps in our understanding of biblical prophecy. But was it just coincidence that these ancient scrolls, they believed they were living in the final generation before God would intervene in human history? They saw themselves as the faithful remnant, the ones who would witness the great battle between good and evil that would usher in God's kingdom on earth. But here's what's fascinating. They weren't just waiting passively for these events to unfold. They were actively preparing for them, containing prophecies about the end times and the restoration of Israel. This was a community that had separated themselves from the corruption they saw in Jerusalem. They had withdrawn to the wilderness, so specific that they read like a military manual for the final war between good and evil. They contained prophecies about a coming Messiah, about the restoration of the temple, about cosmic battles between angels and demons, and about a final judgment that would reshape the world forever. Just as the prophet Isaiah had commanded, "Prepare the way of the Lord in the wilderness." They lived in expectation, studying prophecy, copying sacred texts, and waiting for the signs that would signal the beginning of the end. Were discovered at the exact moment when one of the Bible's greatest prophecies was coming to pass. The sound that echoes back isn't what he expects. Instead of the dull thud of stone hitting stone, he hears the sharp crack of pottery breaking. Europe lies in ruins. The Holocaust has shocked humanity to its core, and the Jewish people are scattered across the globe, many without a homeland. But in the Judean desert, something extraordinary is about to happen that will connect the ancient past to the modern present in ways no one could have imagined. And the times we're living in, these weren't just any ancient texts. Inside that cave, wrapped in linen and sealed in clay jars, were ancient scrolls that had been waiting in darkness for over 2,000 years. But these weren't just any scrolls. They were the carefully preserved library of a mysterious Jewish sect that believed they were living in the final days of human history. Hidden within these scrolls were prophecies so precise, so detailed, that they seemed to predict events happening in our world today. As these ancient prophecies were being pulled from their hiding places, the world was about to witness what many consider the greatest prophetic fulfillment of modern times. On May 14, 1948, just 1 year after the first scrolls were discovered, David Ben-Gurion stood in a museum in Tel Aviv and read these words: "We hereby declare the establishment of a Jewish state in Eretz Israel, to be known as the State of Israel." We'll explore texts that scholars have debated for decades, prophecies that were deliberately concealed by an ancient community that believed they were living in the last days. And by the end of this journey, These scrolls contain secrets that have been waiting nearly 2 millennia to be revealed. Secrets that may hold the key to understanding where we are in God's prophetic timeline. Are you ready to discover what's been hidden in plain sight? You might just discover that these prophecies weren't meant for their time at all, but for ours. Prophecies about the end times, about a final war between good and evil, about the restoration of Israel, and about signs that many believe are unfolding right before our eyes. Have you ever wondered why these scrolls were discovered at the exact same time Israel became a nation again in 1948? Was this just a coincidence, or was there something deeper at work? What if I told you that buried in these ancient texts are prophecies that point to our generation as the one that will witness the fulfillment of biblical prophecy? Today, we're going to dive deep into the most mysterious and controversial prophecies hidden within the Dead Sea Scrolls. If you've ever questioned whether biblical prophecy is real, the story begins in the caves of Qumran, but it doesn't end there. Let's begin this incredible journey into the hidden prophecies of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Picture this scene. Muhammad Dib, a young Bedouin shepherd. What this young shepherd had stumbled upon would prove to be one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in human history. The timing of this discovery is absolutely remarkable. For the first time in nearly 2,000 years, Israel was a nation again. As archaeologists began to explore more caves around Qumran, the community that preserved these scrolls called themselves the Sons of Light. These weren't casual believers. Among the scrolls they left behind are texts that describe events so detailed. But here's where it gets really interesting. The more scholars studied these texts, the more they realized that this community's interpretation of prophecy was remarkably similar to what we see happening in our world today. They believed in a literal return of the Jewish people to their homeland. They expected a physical restoration of the temple in Jerusalem. They anticipated a time when knowledge would increase and when the world would be filled with wars and rumors of wars. Sound familiar? These ancient believers were reading the same prophecies we read today, but they were doing it from a perspective that many modern Christians would recognize. They believed in the literal fulfillment of God's promises to Israel. They expected a coming Messiah who would establish God's kingdom on earth. They saw current events through the lens of biblical prophecy. The question that haunts many scholars is this: were they wrong about the timing, or were they simply looking ahead to our generation? Were their prophecies meant for their time, or for ours? As we examine the specific prophecies contained in these scrolls, we'll discover that many of them couldn't have been fulfilled in the first century. They required events that have only become possible in our modern age. Take, for example, the prophecy of Israel's restoration. The Qumran community believed that the Jewish people would return to their homeland and rebuild the temple. But in their day, Jerusalem was under Roman control, and the temple was still standing. It wasn't until 70 AD that the temple was destroyed and the Jewish people scattered. It wasn't until 1948 that Israel became a nation again. And it wasn't until 1967 that Jerusalem came back under Jewish control. The pieces of the prophetic puzzle were still being put into place, even as these ancient believers were copying and preserving the very prophecies that would point to these future events. They were like librarians of prophecy, carefully preserving texts that would become relevant thousands of years later. But the restoration of Israel is just the beginning. Hidden within these scrolls are prophecies that seem to describe technologies, events, and global conditions that could only exist in our modern world. There are references to knowledge increasing, to the ability to travel quickly across great distances, to weapons of mass destruction, and to a time when the whole world would be able to witness events happening in Jerusalem. The prophet Daniel spoke of a time when many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall increase. The Qumran community took this prophecy literally, believing it pointed to the generation that would witness the end of the age. Today, we live in an era where a person can travel around the world in less than a day, where human knowledge doubles every few years, and where information travels at the speed of light. The book of Revelation describes a time when the whole world will be able to see events happening in Jerusalem. For most of human history, this seemed impossible. How could everyone on Earth witness something happening in one city? But today, with satellite television and the internet, billions of people can watch events unfold in real time from anywhere on the planet. These ancient believers were preserving prophecies that would only make sense in the age of airplanes, computers, and global communication. They were copying texts that described a world that wouldn't exist for another 2,000 years. But somehow, they understood that these prophecies weren't meant for their generation. They were meant for the generation that would see all these signs converging at once. The War Scroll, one of the most dramatic texts found at Qumran, describes a final battle between the sons of light and the sons of darkness. This isn't just a spiritual battle. It's a physical military conflict that will involve the entire world. The scroll describes weapons, battle formations, and strategies that will be used in this final war. It speaks of a conflict that will last for decades and will ultimately result in the complete victory of good over evil. But here's what's remarkable about this prophecy. It describes a world where global warfare is possible, where nations can mobilize armies quickly across great distances, and where the fate of the entire world can be decided in a single conflict. This sounds less like the ancient world and more like our modern age of nuclear weapons, rapid deployment forces, and global military alliances. The Damascus document, another key text from Qumran, speaks of a time when God's people will be scattered across the world, but will begin to return to their homeland in the last days. It describes a process of restoration that will happen gradually, with wave after wave of returning exiles. This matches exactly what we've seen with the return of Jewish people to Israel over the past century. The Temple Scroll provides detailed architectural plans for a future temple that will be built in Jerusalem. This isn't the temple that existed in the first century. This is a different temple, one that will be constructed during the messianic age. The scroll describes a building that is larger and more magnificent than anything that has ever existed. It's a temple designed for the age when God's kingdom is established on earth. For nearly 2,000 years, these prophecies seemed impossible. How could the temple be rebuilt when the Jewish people were scattered across the world? How could Israel be restored when it didn't exist as a nation? How could global warfare be possible when it took months to travel between continents? But today, all of these prerequisites are in place. Israel is a nation again. Jerusalem is under Jewish control. The technology exists for global communication and warfare. The pieces of the prophetic puzzle are falling into place exactly as these ancient texts predicted. The question we must ask ourselves is this: are we living in the generation that will see the fulfillment of these prophecies? Are we witnessing the convergence of signs that the Qumran community believed would herald the end of the age? The evidence suggests that we might be living in the most prophetically significant time in human history. But to understand the full scope of these prophecies, we need to examine the specific texts that reveal what's coming next. We need to look at the prophecies about the final war, the coming Messiah, and the establishment of God's kingdom on earth. These ancient scrolls contain a roadmap for the future, a guide to understanding where we are in God's prophetic timeline. The people of Qumran believed they were living in the final days. They were wrong about the timing, but they may have been right about the signs. The prophecies they preserved point to a generation that would see all these signs converging at once. A generation that would witness the restoration of Israel, the increase of knowledge, the ability for global communication, and the technology for worldwide warfare. Could that generation be ours? The deeper we dig into these ancient texts, the more we discover prophecies that seem tailor-made for our current moment in history. But there's one scroll in particular that has left scholars absolutely stunned, and it's called the War Scroll. This isn't just another religious text. It reads like a detailed military handbook for the final battle between good and evil, and the descriptions it contains are so precise, so modern in their scope, that they could only apply to our technological age. The War Scroll describes a conflict that will span 40 years, involving not just earthly armies, but heavenly forces as well. It speaks of the sons of light, led by the Prince of Light, fighting against the sons of darkness, commanded by Belial, the angel of destruction. But here's what makes this prophecy so remarkable. It describes weapons and warfare, tactics that didn't exist in the ancient world, but are commonplace today. The scroll mentions weapons that can destroy from great distances, battles that will be fought simultaneously across multiple continents, and a conflict where the fate of entire nations will be decided in moments. It describes armies that can move with lightning speed and communication systems that allow commanders to coordinate attacks across vast distances. Does this sound like ancient warfare to you? Or does it sound like modern military strategy? Consider this passage from the War Scroll. On the day when the Qumran fall, there shall be a battle and terrible carnage before the God of Israel. For that shall be the day appointed from ancient times for the battle of destruction of the sons of darkness. The term Qumran was used by the Qumran community to refer to the great powers that would oppose God's people in the last days. Some scholars believe this refers to modern superpowers that would emerge in the end times. But the War Scroll goes even further. It describes a time when the entire world will be divided into two camps with no neutral ground possible. Every nation, every people, every individual will be forced to choose sides in this cosmic conflict. The scroll speaks of alliances that will form rapidly, of nations that will betray their former allies, and of a global polarization that will make compromise impossible. Look around our world today. Do you see nations choosing sides? Do you see alliances forming and breaking apart? Do you see a global divide that seems to be growing deeper every day? The War Scroll predicted a time when the whole world would be forced into two opposing camps, and many believe we're witnessing the beginning of that division right now. The scroll also describes something that would have been incomprehensible to ancient readers, a battle that affects the entire planet simultaneously. It speaks of a conflict where all the nations of the earth will be involved, where the battle will rage from one end of the earth to the other. For most of human history, this would have been impossible. Wars were regional affairs, limited by geography and communication technology. But today, we live in an interconnected world where a conflict in one region can instantly affect the entire globe. We have weapons that can reach any target on Earth within minutes. We have communication systems that allow real-time coordination of military operations across continents. We have economic systems so intertwined that a disruption in one country can trigger a global crisis. The War Scroll seems to anticipate this modern reality. It describes a final conflict that will be truly global in scope, involving technologies and strategies that could only exist in our current age. But it also promises something that gives hope to believers. This war will not end in mutual destruction. It will end with the complete victory of good over evil. Now let's turn our attention to another remarkable text, the Temple Scroll. This is the longest of all the Dead Sea Scrolls, and it contains something absolutely extraordinary. It's not just describing the temple that existed in Jerusalem during the 1st century. It's providing architectural blueprints for a future temple that will be built during the Messianic age. The dimensions described in this scroll are staggering. The temple complex outlined in the text would cover an area larger than the entire old city of Jerusalem today. It describes a building with courts within courts, each one more sacred than the last, leading to an inner sanctuary where God's presence will dwell among His people once again. But here's what's fascinating about these blueprints. They describe construction, techniques and materials that would have been impossible in the ancient world, but are perfectly feasible today. The scroll mentions foundations that go deep into bedrock, walls that can withstand tremendous forces, and a water system that can supply a massive complex with pure flowing water. The Temple Scroll also describes a time when all the nations of the earth will come to Jerusalem to worship. It speaks of facilities designed to accommodate millions of pilgrims, of transportation systems that can move vast numbers of people efficiently, and of communication methods that can coordinate activities across the entire complex. For centuries, these descriptions seemed like fantasy. How could millions of people travel to Jerusalem? How could they be housed and fed? How could such a massive construction project be completed? But today, we have the technology to make all of this possible. We have aircraft that can transport people across the globe in hours. We have construction techniques that can build structures of unprecedented size and complexity. We have communication and logistics systems that can manage operations on a scale the ancient world could never have imagined. The timing of when this temple will be built is also significant. The scroll indicates that its construction will be a sign that we've entered the final phase of human history before God establishes His kingdom on earth. For nearly 2,000 years, this seemed impossible because the Jewish people were scattered across the world and Jerusalem was under foreign control. But in 1967, during the Six-Day War, something remarkable happened. Israeli forces captured the old city of Jerusalem, including the Temple Mount. For the first time since the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 AD suddenly, the possibility of rebuilding the temple shifted from impossible to merely complicated. Today, there are organizations in Israel actively preparing for the construction of the Third Temple. They've recreated the temple vessels, trained priests in the ancient rituals, and developed detailed plans based on biblical specifications. They're not just dreaming about a future temple. They're actively preparing for it. The Temple Scroll describes this future sanctuary as the centerpiece of a restored world, a place where God's presence will be visibly manifest on earth. It speaks of a time when the knowledge of God will cover the earth as the waters cover the sea, when nations will beat their swords into plowshares, and when peace will reign from Jerusalem to the ends of the earth. But perhaps the most intriguing prophecy in the Dead Sea Scrolls concerns a mysterious figure known as Melchizedek. The Melchizedek Scroll, found in Cave 11, describes a heavenly being who will come to earth in the last days to establish justice and judgment. This figure is identified with the Messiah, and the scroll provides a timeline for when this intervention will occur. According to the text, Melchizedek will appear during the 10th Jubilee, which many scholars calculate as corresponding to our current time period. The scroll describes this figure as one who will atone for the sons of light and establish God's kingdom on earth. It speaks of a day of atonement that will follow a period of great tribulation, when Melchizedek will judge the nations and establish righteousness forever. The description of Melchizedek in this scroll is remarkable because it presents him not just as a human leader, but as a divine figure with the authority to judge the entire world. The text says he will execute the vengeance of the judgments of God, and that all the gods of justice will assist him in this task. This Melchizedek figure bears striking similarities to the description of the Messiah in other biblical texts. Like the suffering servant in Isaiah, he comes to atone for sin. Like the Son of Man in Daniel, he receives authority to judge the nations. Like the branch in Zechariah, he will rebuild the temple and rule as both king and priest. The timing indicators in the Melchizedek scroll are particularly intriguing. The text speaks of this intervention occurring during the period when knowledge has increased dramatically, when people can travel rapidly across great distances, and when the Jewish people have returned to their homeland. It describes a time when global communication is possible, and when the whole world can witness events happening in Jerusalem. All of these conditions exist today in ways that would have been impossible throughout most of human history. We live in an age of unprecedented knowledge expansion, where human understanding doubles every few years. We can travel anywhere on earth in less than a day. The Jewish people have returned to their homeland after nearly 2,000 years of exile. We have global communication systems that can transmit information instantly to every corner of the planet. The Melchizedek scroll seems to be describing our current time period with remarkable precision. But it also warns that this period of preparation will be followed by a time of great tribulation, when the forces of darkness will make their final assault against the kingdom of light. Another crucial text is the Damascus document, which provides insight into how God's people should live during the final days before the Messiah's arrival. This document describes a community that has separated itself from the corruption of the world and is living in expectation of God's imminent intervention in history. The Damascus document speaks of a new covenant that God will make with his people in the last days. This covenant will be different from previous covenants because it will be written on the hearts of believers rather than on tablets of stone. It will be a covenant that transforms people from the inside out, giving them the power to live righteously even in a corrupt world. The document also describes signs that will indicate when the end is approaching. It speaks of a time when wickedness will increase dramatically, when false prophets will deceive many, and when even some of God's people will be led astray. It warns of a period when truth will be rare and deception will be common, when people will call evil good and good evil. Does this description sound familiar? Many believers today feel like they're living in exactly the kind of world the Damascus document describes. We see increasing moral confusion, where basic biblical truths are being questioned and rejected. We see false teachers gaining large followings by telling people what they want to hear rather than what they need to hear. We see a culture that increasingly opposes traditional biblical values. But the Damascus document also provides hope. It promises that God will preserve a faithful remnant during these difficult times, people who will remain true to his word despite the pressure to conform to worldly standards. It speaks of a community of believers who will support each other and encourage each other as they wait for the Messiah's return. The document describes this faithful community as the elect of the holy ones, people who have been chosen by God to witness the end of the age. It says they will be given special insight into God's prophetic timeline, enabling them to understand the signs of the times when others are confused and deceived. This raises an important question. Could the people reading these words right now be part of that faithful remnant? Could we be living in the generation that will witness the fulfillment of these ancient prophecies? The convergence of signs described in these texts suggests that we might be closer to the end of the age than most people realize. But there's one more scroll that we need to examine, and it's perhaps the most controversial of all, the Book of Enoch fragments found at Qumran. These texts describe events that supposedly occurred before the Great Flood, but many scholars believe they contain prophetic information about the end times as well. The Enoch fragments describe a time when fallen angels will return to earth and deceive humanity with advanced knowledge and technology. They speak of a period when these beings will present themselves as mankind's saviors, offering solutions to global problems while secretly preparing for humanity's destruction. The texts describe these fallen angels as having the ability to appear as beings of light, to perform miraculous signs and wonders, and to convince even religious people that they are messengers from God. They warn that this deception will be so convincing that, if possible, even the elect would be deceived. In our modern age of UFO sightings, claims of alien contact, and growing interest in extraterrestrial life, these ancient warnings take on new significance. Could the aliens that some people claim to encounter actually be the fallen angels described in these texts? Could the promised disclosure of extraterrestrial contact be part of the great deception warned about in biblical prophecy? The Enoch fragments also describe advanced technology that will be available during the end times, including weapons of mass destruction, genetic manipulation, and artificial intelligence. They warn that humanity will use this technology to rebel against God, believing that they can solve all their problems without divine intervention. Today, we stand on the brink of technological breakthroughs that could fundamentally alter human civilization. Artificial intelligence is advancing rapidly, genetic engineering is becoming commonplace, and weapons of unprecedented destructive power exist in the arsenals of multiple nations. We're living in the kind of technologically advanced world that the Enoch texts warned would exist in the last days. These ancient prophecies seem to be converging in our time with startling precision. The restoration of Israel, the advancement of technology, the increase of knowledge, the possibility of global warfare, the preparation for temple reconstruction, and the growing spiritual deception all point to the same conclusion. We may be living in the generation that will witness the fulfillment of biblical prophecy. The people of Qumran preserved these texts because they believed they contained crucial information for the generation that would live through the end times. They saw themselves as custodians of prophetic knowledge, carefully copying and protecting scrolls that would become relevant thousands of years in the future. But their work wasn't finished with the preservation of these texts. Hidden within the scrolls are specific prophecies about what will happen next, about the sequence of events that will unfold as we approach the climax of human history. These prophecies provide a roadmap for understanding where we are in God's prophetic timeline and what we can expect to see in the days ahead. The prophecies contained within these ancient scrolls paint a picture of our current time that is both sobering and hopeful. They describe a world where ancient enemies of Israel will form coalitions against the Jewish state, where global powers will align themselves against God's chosen people, and where the stage will be set for the final confrontation between good and evil. The War Scroll speaks of specific nations that will rise up against Israel in the last days. It mentions peoples from the north, from the east, and from the south who will converge on the Holy Land with the intention of wiping out God's people once and for all. When we look at the current geopolitical situation in the Middle East, we see exactly this kind of coalition forming. Nations that have been enemies for centuries are finding common ground in their opposition to Israel. But the scrolls also contain a promise that should encourage every believer. They speak of divine intervention at the moment when Israel's enemies seem to have achieved victory. The texts describe supernatural armies coming to the aid of God's people, celestial warriors who will turn the tide of battle in ways that will leave no doubt about who truly controls the destiny of nations. The community rule, another significant text from Qumran, provides insight into how believers should prepare for these coming events. It describes a people who have separated themselves from the corruption of the world, who live by a higher standard, and who remain faithful to God's word even when society around them abandons biblical truth. This document speaks of believers who study prophecy diligently, who understand the signs of the times, and who encourage each other as they see the day of the Lord approaching. It describes a community that lives in expectation, not in fear, because they know that the culmination of history will result in God's ultimate victory. The calendar texts found among the scrolls reveal something fascinating about divine timing. These ancient believers developed sophisticated methods for calculating prophetic periods, and their calculations point to specific time frames when certain events would unfold. While we must be careful not to set dates, the principles they discovered suggest that God operates according to precise timetables that can be discerned by those who study His Word carefully. One of the most intriguing aspects of these calendar calculations is how they align with the Hebrew concept of Jubilee years. The scrolls indicate that certain prophetic events will occur in connection with Jubilee cycles. And when we calculate these periods from key historical events like the restoration of Israel, we find ourselves living in what could be a pivotal Jubilee period. The Copper Scroll, unique among all the Dead Sea Scrolls for being inscribed on metal rather than parchment, contains information about treasures hidden throughout the land of Israel. While archaeologists have never located these physical treasures, some scholars believe the scroll contains coded information about spiritual treasures that will be revealed in the last days. This interpretation suggests that the Copper Scroll is actually describing the restoration of spiritual wealth to God's people, the recovery of biblical truth that has been buried under centuries of tradition and misinterpretation. In our time, we're witnessing exactly this kind of spiritual treasure recovery as believers around the world rediscover biblical truths that have been hidden for generations. The Isaiah Scroll, the most complete manuscript found at Qumran, contains prophecies that speak directly to our current historical moment. Chapter 66 describes a time when Israel will be reborn as a nation in a single day, when Jerusalem will become a source of controversy for the entire world, and when global events will converge on this ancient city. On May 14, 1948, Israel was indeed reborn as a nation in a single day, fulfilling Isaiah's prophecy with stunning precision. Since then, Jerusalem has become the focal point of international attention in ways that would have seemed impossible just decades ago. Every major news organization in the world has correspondents stationed in Jerusalem, ready to report on events that could have global implications. The Isaiah scroll also contains prophecies about the restoration of Hebrew as a living language, about the desert blooming like a rose, and about the Jewish people returning from the four corners of the earth. All of these prophecies have been fulfilled in remarkable ways since Israel's restoration, providing powerful evidence that we're living in prophetically significant times. But perhaps the most significant aspect of the Dead Sea Scrolls is what they reveal about the nature of biblical prophecy itself. These texts demonstrate that prophecy is not just about predicting the future. It's about understanding God's eternal plan and recognizing how current events fit into that larger narrative. The Qumran community understood that they were living in a cosmic drama that began in the Garden of Eden and will culminate with the establishment of God's kingdom on earth. They saw themselves as players in this drama, with specific roles to play in preparing for the final act. Today, as we witness the convergence of prophetic signs described in these ancient texts, we must ask ourselves the same question the Qumran community faced. What is our role in this unfolding drama? How should we live knowing that we may be witnessing the fulfillment of prophecies that have been waiting thousands of years to come to pass? The scrolls provide clear guidance on this question. They speak of a people who remain faithful to God's word regardless of cultural pressure, who study prophecy not out of curiosity but out of obedience, and who live each day in the expectation that the Messiah could return at any moment. The thanksgiving hymns found at Qumran express the heart attitude that should characterize believers living in the last days. These psalms speak of gratitude for being chosen to witness the culmination of God's plan, of joy in understanding prophetic truth, and of confidence in God's ultimate victory over evil. As we conclude our exploration of these remarkable texts, we're left with an inescapable conclusion. The Dead Sea Scrolls were preserved not just as historical artifacts, but as prophetic guidebooks for our generation. The community that hid these scrolls in desert caves understood that they contained information that would become crucial for believers living in the last days. The convergence of signs we're witnessing today, from the restoration of Israel to the advancement of technology, from the increase of knowledge to the possibility of global warfare, all point to the same reality. We may be living in the generation that will see the fulfillment of biblical prophecy. The question that remains is this: are we prepared? Are we living like the faithful community described in these scrolls, studying God's word, understanding the times, and remaining faithful regardless of the pressures around us? The young shepherd boy who discovered these scrolls in 1947 had no idea that he was uncovering texts that would prove to be prophetically significant for our time. But God knew. He orchestrated that discovery to occur at the exact moment when Israel was being reborn as a nation, ensuring that these ancient prophecies would be revealed just when they would become most relevant. The hidden prophecies of the Dead Sea Scrolls are hidden no longer. They've been brought to light for our generation, for our time, for this pivotal moment in human history. The question is, what will we do with this knowledge? Will we heed the warnings contained in these texts? Will we prepare our hearts for what may be coming? Will we live as faithful witnesses in a generation that may see the return of the King? The scrolls have spoken. The prophecies have been revealed. The signs are converging. The only question that remains is whether we'll have eyes to see and ears to hear what the Spirit is saying to the churches in these last days. The Dead Sea Scrolls remind us that God's word endures forever, that His promises never fail, and that those who trust in Him will never be put to shame. As we navigate these uncertain times, May we find comfort in the truth that the same God who preserved these prophecies for nearly 2,000 years is the same God who holds our future in his hands. The hidden has become revealed. The ancient has become current. The prophecies are unfolding. Are you ready? If this exploration has opened your eyes to the prophetic significance of our times, share this message with others who need to understand what's happening in our world today. Subscribe to stay connected as we continue to explore how biblical prophecy is being fulfilled in our generation. And remember, in a world filled with uncertainty, we can have confidence knowing that God's word never fails and his promises always come to pass. The scrolls have done their work. They've preserved God's truth across the centuries and delivered it to us at exactly the right moment in history. Now it's our turn to be faithful stewards of this prophetic knowledge, living as lights in the darkness and witnesses to the truth that God is still on his throne and his kingdom will come.